Shemai pal, this is Benjamin, welcome to the channel. Today we're talking about Wales. From the 1820s into the 1840s, this was the most militarized place in Britain. The state was very afraid that we were about to rise up in revolution, and actually we did. Why did it get that way? What happened, and what did it lead to after? That's what this video is about. Before I get into what happened with these armed insurrections, we need to explain 4 chief concepts so that you know the context of what was happening in this period. So first of all, you had the Reform Act of 1832. Now this is important in its date because it divides time. The upheavals, the Merthyr Uprising, was before this, and the Chartist Uprising in Casnewydd later was after this, and they took on different characters because of what this reform bill did. It allowed people of some description who were not basically the landed aristocracy to take part in democracy. The second thing of these 4 is the People's Charter in 1838. This was 6 main demands put forward by a group of people, the Chartists, which I'll get to in a moment, toward Parliament. And the 6 demands were this. Number 1, universal suffrage, everybody gaining the vote. 2nd, no property qualification to be an MP. 3, annul parliaments. Number 4, equal representation. 5, payment of MPs. 6, and as an American originally, this blew my mind. The secret ballot in Britain was not brought in until 1871. What this means is that the landlords and the employers that you worked under could see how you voted and say, well, you know, you want to keep your job, you should really vote for the candidate that I want. The third one is the Chartists, who put forward that People's Charter. Now this took root especially in London and in Glasgow, but it also filtered in through the industrial areas that I'm going to discuss in this video. But these Chartists, they were signing petitions, they were having direct protest, and in the case of the valleys here and in Gwent, armed insurrection. Now about the 4th thing, the Unitarians, this was a faith, a divergent Christianity. And this Unitarianism had some beliefs which are a direct connection later to the socialist doctrine which came in through the Labour Party and English and Scottish influence coming into Wales. And what they believed was a lack of original sin. They believed especially in the oneness of everything. To begin this age, I need to explain just how rupturous this industrialization was upon our country. Like some of these images here. But I'm going to start by reading a paragraph here, just to give you an idea. I'm going to say the place names in Welsh, of course. Iron set the pace, running its furnaces along the heads of narrow trench valleys on the plateau, in the armpit of Banabrecheiniog, and threading coal workings and other plants down those valleys. The iron works, with the mushrooming settlements of their thousands of workers, ran in a clamorous arc from Aberdare and Hirwaun in the west, through the matrix of Merthyr, into Tredegar, Glynebwy, east to Bryn Mawr and down to Blanavon, Pontypool, the beginnings of Pontypridd. Around the privileged port of Casnewydd sprouted a coal-selling industry in the lower valleys of Gwent, run by ambitious but marginal Welsh adventurers. Continuous technical development drove iron westwards into the already developed anthracite districts behind Casnewydd and Abertawe, themselves building on their world monopoly in copper, tin plate and its related industries. From the 1840s, coal began to shift into Aberdare and Rhondda, carrying the customs of the colliers with it. A complex of small-scale subsidiaries and services sprang up around the rich and the blindly, wastefully exploited coal, ironstone, limestone. Into them swarmed those half-forgotten people of Welsh industry, the urban middle class and the Welsh plutocracy. Into small plants and works, into coal, into haulage, minor engineering, the professions, trade, commerce. The shopocracy. He's a bit openly Marxist in his views. It gets quite obvious now that we enter the modern age. The shopocracy, making fortunes in between strategic bankruptcies, looming over scurries of ambitious workers horning their way into a precarious, sometimes bandit penny capitalism. He does have a bit of grudge against capitalism. Of these new developed plants, these industrial centres, Dowlais and Cyfarthfa were the biggest, attracting a new breed of inventors to create machines in order to get the resources out of the earth and into England. A new kind of young mining apprentice spread over Wales. New professions. Watkin George had a great water wheel, finding its ways into popular ballads. And we blessed the world with steam. A Cornishman, Trevithick, ran down iron rails near Merthyr Tydfil, from Penydarren down to Abercynon. And this was a very primitive early attempt in 1804, but it proved the vast wealth under the earth, because though our topsoil is very thin and acidic, the underlayers of Wales are rich, and England in its expanding empire wanted to take it out of us and feed itself with it. The heartland of this new industrial and new civilization was the upper plateau just before Beca, and people weren't ever really meant to live here in mass, but it boomed because of the resources under the earth were so wealthy. These new people living here struggled out of company towns in mauled Moon Mountain landscape against all odds to create some of the most remarkable working class communities in Britain. New kinds of society grew here in Wales. Except in times of slump, they were always better off than their cousins in the West. Wages, though, fluctuated wildly. Often the wage down in these mines was 6 times what you could make on a farm further west. And it began to draw people in, especially to Merthyr Tydfil. Their housing, too, while simple and sometimes crude, was markedly superior to that of rural areas. But the human inflow became unmanageable, throwing up communities all over the place, breeding semi-pirate and bohemian districts outside the law. Speculators, crooks swarmed in, alongside the reasonably adequate settlements provided by the industry masters for their skilled men. Cheap housing sprouted like weed between the pits and the works on tips, in every nook and cranny, in slumps, clusters, in indesirable tangles. Sanitation and public services were non-existent. Epidemics were frequent, and just after this era, in 1849, cholera struck Merthyr Tydfil, killing 1,400 people. But organised streets and squares began to sprinkle all over Wales. Civic planning developed here, and it required people. This explosive emergence of industry in the southeast transformed the southwest, drawing men out. And Llanbydder, famous for its horse breeds at the time, its horse shows, gradually switched over to breeding pit ponies for the coal mines, changed the whole landscape, even those beyond the industrial furnaces. Dyffryn Teifi began to sprout wooden mills, churning out flannel shirts for industrial workers. Ripples of wage demands running outwards from the highly paid east sent circles of disturbance through parish after parish. People were moving out, at first in seasonal rhythm, but then people from the west were actually colonizing the east. And it changed the east, explicitly Gwent area, politically. Dowlais and tracts of Gwent were largely peopled by them, even as its lead mines declined. The little ports of the southwest were enlivened as people moved toward the coast. The area remained politically quiet under its gentry, but its subterranean crisis got worse. The inflated agricultural prices of the Napoleonic Wars had sent people swarming up the hillsides, population pressure, building and building and building, kept them up there and stirred an underground struggle of farmers, squatters, displaced lead miners, fighting over cottages, pasture, right to common land. There was an outbreak of sheep rustling. Farmers who bought additional farms found open coffins outside the door. There was an economic jealousy within the society, a social division between those who had achieved economic aspiration and those who felt a bit left behind, and this resentment festered and was added fuel on the fire by English landowners in addition to their own people. A gnawing hunger for land possessed whole communities. The descent of the region, heavily furthered by a newer Methodism, began to move out of the defensive withdrawal of the West into a militancy as its society slithered into a growing disaffection against an Anglican magistracy. Caerphilly had printing presses and a collection of small shops, and it was a central focal point, and it erupted in this political fervor in a way that was different from the East. It had influences from the farming lands around it, and a different kind of resentment was billowing up. Tension grew between tenant, farmer, and landlord, dissenter and Anglican. The town was to produce Wales's first working men's association, dedicated to the People's Charter. A populous nation was forming in small, behind a language line and a religious line, which now was clearly becoming a class line. But Caerphilly was not only just radiating to the west, it was moving east as people moved east for these new industrial jobs, and they brought this nonconformist political sentiment that was brewing there with them. When the laboring people of this hinterland moved east, they took their vivid popular culture with them. Not least, they took their Cefalbren. Cefalbren is like, it means wooden horse, and it's like this rack. Basically, it's a form of mob rule punishment. It's in my view, it's disgusting, but it's basically, there was this Scottish cattle movement, which I can't go into too much. Let me know if you want a video explicitly on it. And they felt certain people had wronged against the community for being more economically aspirational in some cases, or openly Tory, or openly pro-conservative, or Anglican or some sense, and they would go out and publicly beat them for not adhering to the community's status quo. I mean, it's highly conformist, it's deeply oppressive, but their view is they were doing it for social justice reasons for the poor, and this Scottish cattle group had secret meetings, and they would howl horns up in the hills to frighten people. It was very much public intimidation through this growing idea of class struggle, one that I'm not very comfortable with, because it is quite oppressive and malevolent. What's important here is that they were doing it in a Welsh way. They were answering to it in Welsh custom, through changing Welsh culture toward this Chartist influence that was coming from England, yes, but they were adapting to it and changing it. There were wars over enclosures, like in the War of the Little Englishmen, when 600 people fought off a guy trying to enclose land. These people chased off the landowner dressed in women's clothing. Now that's significant to what happened later. As people moved into these industrial areas, they became Welsh. I mean, people from England coming, because I guarantee you, if you're down in that hole of a coal pit for like 10 hours a day, after a few months, you're going to come out speaking fluent Welsh. There's nothing you're going to be able to do to stop it, because you're down there with like 10 other guys, and they're all speaking Welsh. But the people who came in from England and Scotland as well, and bits of Ireland, they brought new ideas politically with them, explicitly from those of this seeking governmental reform. But popular culture was changing as well, because you had people concentrated in urban environments for the first time, truly. The overlay of industrial masters and this imported society from other countries, many shopkeepers, changed us. We produced papers. The Swansea Cambrian in 1804 had come, the Carmarthen Journal in 1810, in 1829, the Monmouthshire Merlin, the Merthyr Guardian, the Welshman, and others. Much official life was in English, but the Welsh language was expanding territory in some areas because of this influx. Many came from the other side of the river Severn, and from Cornwall beyond. And I'd like to mention as well that the Jewish community took root in Merthyr Tydfil in the 1820s as clothiers and pawnbrokers. Now, we had Jewish community a century earlier, Abertawe, and later in the 1840s, a Jewish community took root in Caerdydd and Pontypridd. This bit in Merthyr here, it was not part of the industrial mining operation, and as Judaism re-rooted itself in Wales, it was not through the industrial sense. It was through trying to make a living through honest bargain. And that's important because in the riots of 1911 later, Jews were attacked from the view of this left-wing perspective of attacking capital. Sioni Sgiborfawr, a red-haired giant from Penderyn, claimed to be the best boxer in Wales. The heart of Merthyr became almost like a red light district. Pubs, shady areas opened up, and in such areas at the time, of course, you needed musicians. And they came in droves. We had ballad singers in the area, and Lady Charlotte Guest of the nobility. She translated Welsh classics. These industrial masters in their class were not simply people coming in who hated our culture. They often were our greatest patrons, helping us to keep it. So I'm quite uncomfortable with the idea of this impenetrable class divide. People were moving back and forth along both lines of it. Merthyr, easily the largest town in Wales, attracted ballad singers and poets. People flocked to where the money was. Among the most famous of these was Dick Dywyll, Dick Dark, a blind singer from the north, singing his song sheets on the streets on a Sunday. He even won an Eisteddfod prize. And the Eisteddfods sprinkled up minor ones, promoting poets and singers all over, especially at the heads of the valleys, the Cymrigyddion, amateur learning society, basically among the common people, sprinkling up all around these industrial areas. We were promoting a Welsh language culture within this new urban space. And at first these Eisteddfods were the world of the dark pub, but it wasn't long before the nonconformist liberal variety of the aspirational man took them over and made the Eisteddfod a bit more respectable. Earlier on, this nonconformist revival was in the chapel full of workers who formed friendly societies to build their own houses. By the 1830s, The chapels totally overshadowed the church. 95 chapels to 12 churches in the uplands. They were mostly Independents and Baptists, though Calvinistic Methodists were there too, with Wesleyans coming in from England. By the mid-century, only the Calvinistic Methodists seem to have played the social role unhesitatingly allotted to them by English historians. But the distinction between pub people and chapel people was not firm. Early chapels first met in pubs. They were no doubt a minority. They grew. But they were also highly democratic in their inner life. These religious nonconformists were very politically active and highly democratic in an age when Westminster was not democratic at all. And them, moving into the areas around Merthyr and further down to the southeast in Casnewydd, changed the culture, stoking it, fusing with just Chartism. Out of these religious men often came verse and music festivals, and choirs as well would come. Their composers achieved some fame, and they democratized music. This democratization of music and political thought through the fusion of nonconformist faith in an industrial setting happened as well, by the way, up north in Bethesda in Gwynedd, which was not at all surrounded by areas like it. Bethesda was very much an island of the social conditions of the southeast around Merthyr and Gwent, up in an area where it was not the common thing at all. But the divide remained between rural and industrial, and they were about to rebel against the authorities in different ways. Industrial capitalism came ferociously into Wales from English masters, but it was fought equally hard, especially through the ideas of these religious faiths. Unitarianism, with its oneness and collective ideas in the East, and Methodism with its hyper-individual rights under that faith in the West. And as people changed location, moving for work, these ideas mixed with each other and spread to ignite a political resistance. The economic slump of 1829 came at the precise moment when these political notions coming out of Unitarianism spread through Merthyr Tydfil. And Crauchete, the industrial master, radicals had taken control then, however, with William Crauchete II, a radical ironmaster. The National Association for the Protection of Labour, NAPL, there's so many abbreviations coming down the road with all these unions and stuff. But they moved into Atrachung and the northeast and stoked riots in the coalfields. Merthyr was not far behind. When NAPL's delegates moved on to Merthyr in the summer of 1831, they ran into mass political meetings organized by workmen who had been brought into action by Crauchete. Lewis Herhelior, Lewis the Huntsman, led basically a justice uprising under a red cloth to get back goods confiscated from the poor for their debts, basically. And it erupted into a full-scale armed revolt. When troops marched in from Aberhonddu, the crowd led by Lewis attacked them head-on. 24 were killed and over 70 wounded, but they forced the military to quit the town. There was a communal insurrection under arms. The rebellion spread into neighboring valleys, people coming there to join. They even spoke of rebellions in Lancashire, Yorkshire, and London over in England. They held the town for 4 days, defeated and disarmed an armed troop from Abertawe, beating back ammunition trains from Aberhonddu. but they were crushed after 450 soldiers, across muskets, faced down a crowd of 20,000 coming from Sirvanwy to join the revolt, after up to 1,000 troops had closed in on the town. Lewis and several others were deported, but Dick Penderyn, a man who was most probably innocent, was hung. He's never been pardoned. Between 1839 and 1843, the Cefabrens cousins appear in the southwest, Beca, the daughters of Rebecca, and this is a quite unusual and, in some instances, comical uprising. The tensions in the southwest exploded in a rebellion of small farmers against middlemen and rack renters, tithe-grubbing landlords and magistrates, which found its flashpoint in the toll gates erected to levy funds. So in the era there were tolls that people, especially farmers and craftsmen, had to pay just to transport their goods around rural areas. And this was vastly unfair to working people and especially middle-class people, which ignited a kind of revolt in the southwest, which was very different to the east, but it still had the same ethos. They began as the Chartist movement was taking its rise in 1839, when a crowd dressed as women attacked a toll gate in Narberth in Sir. Their leader Tom Rees was a fistfighter known as Tom Carnabuth. He could not find clothes to fit and borrowed some from a neighbour, Big Rebecca. But when the revolt broke out again in 1842, in the aftermath of a Chartist general strike, they had found a more biblical warrant in Genesis. And they blessed Rebecca and said unto her, Let thy seed possess the gates of them that hate thee. Within a few months the southwest, especially Sirgarvirth and around Carmarthen, had become ungovernable. Men dressed as women would appear, destroy tolls, and vanish. They had to bring in people to put these down, but they kept flaring up. Bands of men dressed as women, frequently led by someone on a horse, often white, staged elaborate pantomimes before a gate and then destroyed it, returning again and again. The scope of Rebecca, the hated workhouses of the new poor law were hit. Rebecca even forcefully reconciled estranged couples. These groups under Rebecca were acting like moral police, forcing people in public to go against the law for the sake of their moral beliefs. And you can't blame them entirely, because the poor laws at the time they were disgusting. In June 1843, Rebecca and her children marched openly into the town of Carmarthen, led by Mark Bowen of Trelech, winking at friends in his brilliant white dress with locks of horsehair, and joined by the town's poor, attacked the workhouse. The masses, to a man, throughout 3 counties of Carmarthen, Cardigan and Pembroke are with me, ran Rebecca's proclamation to the Welshman newspaper, and it said, Oh yes, they are my children. When I meet the lime men on the road covered with sweat and dust, I know they are Rebeccaites. When I see the coal men coming to the town clothed in rags, hard-worked and hard-fed, I know they are mine. These are Rebecca's children. When I see the farmers' wives carrying loaded baskets to market, bending under the weight, I know well that these are my daughters. If I turn into a farmer's house and see them eating barley bread and drinking whey, I surely, say I, these are the members of my family. These are the oppressed sons and the daughters of Rebecca. This religious connotation fusing with Chartist elements was no accident. They knew entirely what they were doing, and the authorities were terrified. From this point, over the next decade, there was a militant, working class, divisive resentment that governed the southeast with this notion of class warfare. And I'm not really comfortable with that kind of thing, but it's an important part in our history, and you can't get over the fact that people were dying of sickness due to poverty and there was a lack of food. People in the crowd of the Merthyr Uprising were screaming bara, bread. There was a new law called the Poor Law, and this was grouped with a series of legislations which meant, you had debtors' prisons, you had workhouses, people were being transported to Australia. But also because of the Reform Bill, it meant there was not a Liberal Party per se yet, but a group of politicians began to gather who were sort of the last of the Whigs, and they were basically Liberal MPs at this point, though not in name. And they began to contest elections which prior had ran unopposed. And this caused a new type of man to emerge, a working class man who was not a revolutionary, but a reformer, which meant you had two types of people opposed to this harsh, exploitative industry and high Tory rule. You had reformers, which were about to become liberals, and you had the radical Chartists. And these two began to be opposed to each other. And in the next uprising, the Chartist Uprising in Casnewydd, these two were at loggerheads, and the reformists, in a way, caused the defeat of the Chartists. Chartism entrenched itself in mid-Wales too, in Powys, and especially down in Caerfyrddin. But as workers went east, it gathered and intensified, especially in Gwent. And this was the scene of a bloody and the last armed revolt that we have had in Wales. There was a highly militant and conscious vanguard among the then well-paid workers of Gwent, who put up their own leaders, and Zephaniah Williams of Nantaglaw, and Jack Pfeiffer. This man, I'm a Texan, he went and fought for the Texas War of Independence in 1835, just as it was kicking off. He helped take San Antonio before it was retaken by the Mexicans. He had already come back to Wales by 1839, and they put him in charge of troops, basically. Llanidloes broke into riot, but Gwent rose in insurrection. The Chartist Convention and the petition had failed to reform. Iron Men launched a vastly ambitious plan for a Silurian republic which would take over the major towns, the ironworks, the collieries, seize essential river crossings to block off the military, and signal for armed revolution throughout Britain. It didn't work out, there was a bit of bad weather, but Casnewydd rose in revolt anyway. But by this time there were military garrisons in 5 major towns in the south, and the middle class was now armed against them. They were pro-reform, but not in extremity. They valued their high-paid position and did not want any nonsense getting in the way of their newfound wealth. This uprising in Casnewydd was brutally crushed. They didn't really have a chance. And by 1843, at its end, this was the end of an era, really. But there was a reform in the air. It was not all quiet. It wasn't all distawrwydd. There was a new kind of man, a working man coming, and it was a liberal type of man. And this type of man, this quiet economic progress, would steer Wales for the next 80 years. I don't have time to go into the extent of this Chartist uprising, but it was bloody. And it was the end of an era and the beginning of another one, because the age of armed insurrection was over. And a new, quiet, though deeply political reform hostile to the Anglican authorities had begun. We were still marking ourselves off as different from those lording over us, but we were coming to a new way of fighting it. May I take this opportunity to thank my Patreons for their kind donation. It helps keeps the channel going. Diolch yn fawr iawn. And for all of you, thank you for watching. A super like often helps. And leave a comment below if you have a question, and we'll get to you next time in the next episode.